thank you all for joining us today for our presentation on E-2 visa investor requirements and renewal considerations. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am a senior associate with Scott Legal PC. And joining me today is Michaela Romesser, who is also a senior associate at the firm. Our firm regularly handles E-2 visas. It's probably the most common visa we handle. So we see a high number of these around the world at consulates as well as within the US at USCIS. And so today we'll be sharing with you some key information that we've gathered from our experience preparing and assisting clients with these visa applications. But in general, I will say that there's good reason for this being such a common option. Because if you do have E-2 treaty nationality, and we'll talk about what that means, the E-2 visa is really one of the best ways for a foreign national to come to the US and develop and direct a business. It really is a wonderful option. But a few housekeeping items before we get started. We do try to do several webinars a week, and these cover a variety of visa options. Our firm handles family immigration, we handle humanitarian immigration, we handle a variety of business immigration visas. And so in these webinars, we do try to cover topics that run the full gamut of these options. So we hope that you will sign up for future webinars if they are helpful to you. Our webinars are recorded, and this webinar is being recorded. After the webinar, we will be posting this recording to our YouTube channel. And on our YouTube channel, you can see our previous webinars as well, again, on a variety of topics. So please do check out our YouTube channel and watch those. We hope they're helpful to you. The email we'll send after this presentation will have a link to our YouTube channel, and we'll have the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen. If you have a question, we do plan to answer all the questions that come up during the presentation. We'll likely save those for the end. But if you do have a question, don't hesitate to send it in using either the chat function on Zoom or the Q&A function on Zoom. And Michaela and I will be monitoring those and plan to, again, to respond to all the questions by the end of the presentation today. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and pass it off to Michaela to talk about E-2 visa rules and regulations.
Thank you so much, Dustin, and good morning, everyone. Let's go over the definition of what the E-2 visa is and who can qualify for the E-2 visa. The E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of certain countries to come to the US and run the operations of a business in which they have invested substantial amount of money. So there are basically two options how you can get an E-2 visa. So you can either purchase an existing business in the US. So this would also include purchasing a franchise. Franchises are, great option for an E-2. Or the second option would be if you want to start your own business from the scratch. The second option would be to just kind of start your own business and then purchase everything necessary to get the operations of the business started. So to qualify for an E-2, there must be a treaty between your country and the United States. So many countries all over the world have this treaty with the US. So many countries from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East do have these treaties. Some countries are, for example, Canada, Mexico, UK, Germany, Italy, France, and Japan, and many, many others. You would just want to double check, if your country has this treaty. What is important here is the country of your nationality. So let's say, for example, that you were born in India or China. These countries unfortunately are not E-2 visa treaty countries, but later in your life you obtain another citizenship. For example, you became a citizen of, Spain or UK, you could apply for an E-2 visa under that passport. So what really matters is if whether you have a passport of the E-2 visa treaty country, and the country of birth, doesn't, that doesn't really play a role in the E-2 visa nationality analysis. So for how long can you get the E-2 visa for? So this will depend on your country of nationality. So nationals of some countries can get the E-2 visa for up to 5 years, and many countries have the 5-year mark. For example, if you are a national of Canada, UK, you could get the E-2 visa for 5 years. But there are some countries where the reciprocity period, the reciprocity period is basically the length of time the E-2 visa can be issued for, where it's shorter than 5 years. So there are some countries where, the nationals can only get the E-2 visa for 4 years, some countries 2 years, some countries 1 year, and nationals of some countries can get the E-2 visa only for a period of a few months. So for example, if you are a national of Jordan, you could only get the E-2 visa issued for a period of 3 months. So during the period of 3 months, you could enter the US on the E-2 visa. But if you want to travel internationally after the E-2 visa expires, then you would have to go back to the consulate and renew the visa. But I would say the majority, of countries, the reciprocity period is much longer. It's usually 1 year, or longer. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that, regardless of how long the E-2 visa is issued for, every time you enter the US on the E-2 visa, you will be allowed to stay for a period of 2 years. So let's say that you are a national of Jordan, the E-2 visa itself is only valid for a period of 3 months. When you enter the US, you will be allowed to stay for a period of 2 years. You would want to, of course, double check your I-94 on the CBP website just to make sure that you were admitted for a period of 2 years, but that's the period of time CBP, admits E-2 investors or E-2 employees for. And the same thing would be, for example, if you are a national of Canada, you get the E-2, you got the E-2 visa for a period of 5 years. You would also only be allowed to stay for a period of 2 years at a time. So, the I-94 would only be issued for 2 years. Then before the 2-year period is up, you would have to leave the US. And then as long as your E-2 visa is valid, you could re-enter, and then you would get another 2-year period. Perfect. So let's go over the E-2 visa requirements in a little bit more detail. So the first one we discussed already. So, to qualify, you have to be a national of a treaty country. Sometimes people ask, like, I'm a permanent resident of Canada, like, can I apply? So unfortunately not. You do have to have a nationality of the E-2 visa treaty country. And as we discussed, it's the country, you are a national citizen of, and the country of birth, that doesn't matter. The second requirement is you must make an investment in the US to qualify for the E-2 visa. So, what does this mean? Like what is investment? Like how much money do you have to invest? Where can the money come from? So let's go over all of these. So the E-2 funds you are investing, they must be at risk. And so this means that, at the time you are applying for the E-2 visa, the money, has to be already spent, invested in the US on various either expenditures if you are starting a business, or if you're buying a business, the money had to be transferred already to the seller, or possibly to an escrow agent. So, like, let's say that, like you have, you transferred like $100,000 from your foreign personal account to US company's account in the US, and you have $100,000 on the company's bank account in the US. and you plan to make all these expenditures, like after your E-2 visa is approved. Like will this work for E-2? So the answer, is unfortunately not. So for the E-2, as we said, the money has to be spent at the time you are applying for E-2. So if you have money sitting on the bank account and you say to the officer that you are planning to make all these expenditures in the future, unfortunately that will not work. You have to make the expenditures before you apply for the E-2 visa. So now, what is the source of funds and where, where can the investment money come from? So basically, the investment money can come from any legitimate source. The government just wants to make sure that the money is not coming from criminal or illegitimate activities. So, if the money comes from your personal savings from employment, that's fine. If the money comes from gift, either from a family member or a friend, that is fine as well. The money can also come from sale of property you own, or the money can also come from loan. So just a quick note for the gifts and loans. Gifts and loans are fine. But, so like, let's say that, you have a family member and the family member is gifting you like $150,000 to start the E-2 business. So, in that case, we would have to submit the gift letter, from the person who is gifting you the funds to you. The gift letter should briefly explain, like how much money the person is gifting to you and where the money comes from. So like, let's say that your aunt, like is employed and the money, she's gifting you comes from her savings from employment over the years. We would still have to submit, some supporting documents, just showing the source of the funds the aunt is gifting to you. So in this case, we would have to submit 2 or 3 most recent tax returns of your aunt, just kind of showing, how much money she earned over the years to kind of justify that, like she was able to make this gift for you. And the same would be, for a loan. So the E-2 investment must be substantial, and we'll go over this in a little bit more detail on the next slide, like what substantial means. So what are some typical E-2 expenditures, that could count? So, in case you are purchasing a business in the US or, purchasing a franchise, then if you're purchasing business, then the E-2 investment would be the purchase price. You pay either to the seller or to an escrow agent, and usually, like that would be the only thing we would we would include. And then in case you are starting a business in the US, then we could include basically any expenditures you made that were necessary to get the business up and running. So, like in case you will be selling products in the US, we would include the inventory you purchased. We could include any equipment. So, like computer equipment, office equipment, like any equipment you need to run the business. We could include any money you paid for, the website setup, or any money you paid for marketing. If you purchase any like office supplies, we could include that. Any money you pay for office rent or warehouse rent, in case you need to store the inventory, we could include all of that. And we could also include the legal fees and also any kind of fees you paid for the business entity setup. Just a quick thing I wanted to mention on the purchase of the business. So in case you are interested in this option, I mentioned a couple times an escrow agent and escrow. So what does it mean? So in case, like if you're interested to purchase a business, you can do it, two ways. So like you can either sign the purchase sale agreement and then you can transfer the money to the seller. The risk of kind of this transaction is that, like in case your E-2 visa is not approved, like you still purchase the business, you will have to hire someone to operate the business, or you will still be the owner of the business. You cannot get out of the transaction. And, some people are fine like going with this option because like they find a business in the US and they're fine kind of having that risk in mind that even if the E-2 is not approved, they are interested in purchasing this particular business. The other option would be to sign an escrow agreement, and this would mean that you and the seller would have to find an escrow agent, and all of you would sign an escrow agreement. And then for the escrow, like all of the contingencies to the purchase sale would have to be met, like before we apply for an E-2. But there could be one contingency left, and that is the approval of the E-2 visa. So the escrow agreement would have a language that, like you would transfer the purchase price to the escrow agent, and the escrow agent would hold the funds. And then if the E-2 visa is approved, the escrow agent would transfer the money to the seller. But if the E-2 is not approved for any reason, the money would come back to you. So, many people like to do transactions like for E-2 through the escrow because they have that peace in mind that if for any reason the E-2 is not approved, like they will not lose all this money, and they will get the money back. Perfect. So let's go back to the requirements. So the third requirement is that the E-2 business cannot be marginal. And we'll go over this in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. But the marginality requirement means that basically the E-2 business has to have capacity to hire you as employees. And it doesn't mean like you have to have the employees at the time you apply. But if it's a new business, you would have to submit a business plan. And in that business plan, you have to outline the hiring projections for the next 5 years, and you would want to show that in the next 5 years, the business will have capacity to hire at least 3 full-time employees. Then the next requirement is that the business must be real and operating. So this means that the business is already taking revenue or is like really, really close to start operating after the E-2 visa is granted. So, like what evidence would you submit to show that the E-2 business is real and operating? So in case you purchase an already existing business, like you would be submitting evidence such as the company's, most recent tax returns, the company's current profit and loss statement, balance sheet, the company's the W-2s and payroll, bank statements showing incoming payments from clients and things like that, website and contracts and things like that, showing that, the business is already running, the business is generating revenue, the business is paying employees. In case you are starting a new business in the US and the business is kind of not taking revenue yet, but it's really close to getting the operation started. The only thing missing is the approval of the E-2 visa. In that case, you would be submitting evidence such as, showing that you set up the entity in the US, you made the investment in the US, you have set up a bank account, you have set up a website, you have signed a lease. Or if you have letters of intent from potential clients, that's always very helpful to submit. If you can get contracts signed with clients, that is also really helpful. Always for the E-2 to show that, like you already have clients, like interested in your services or goods, and they were willing to sign either letters of intent or contracts. So the next requirement is that you are coming to the US to solely develop and direct the operations of the E-2 business. So, for the E-2, if you're applying for an E-2 investor visa, you do have to show that you will have an active role in the operations of the E-2 company. So, like let's say that you are retired, then you want to move to the US, and you are thinking of investing in some business, but like you don't want to have any role in the business, or like do anything for a business, then the E2 would not be an option for you, because for an E2 we do have to show that you will have an active role in the operations of the E2 company, and generally you would want to show that you will have kind of like a high executive or managerial role in the business, and then you will have employees like doing the actual kind of client work or admin work and things like that. So the next requirement is that you must own at least 50% in the E2 company. And this is a requirement that has to be met, at the time we apply for the E2 visa, but you always have to keep at least 50% ownership, like throughout the time you are in the US on an E2. So this is really important to keep in mind, that, in case, you own 100%, but like later, some opportunity comes and you want to sell, some ownership to someone else. It's important to keep in mind that you do always have to keep at least 50% in the company, because if the ownership drops below 50%, like you would no longer be meeting the E2 visa kind of requirements and be in E2 status. So this is really important to keep in mind. And then the last requirement is that you have to have intent to return to your home country before the E2 visa expires. So the E2 visa, it's a non-immigrant visa. It's not a green card. It's a non-immigrant visa. So you do have to show that you have a non-immigrant intent, and you don't kind of plan to stay in the US permanently. That being said, the E2 is not like a B2 tourist visa, where you have to show that you have all these ties to your home country, such as you have a job in your home country, you own property there, you have family there. For the E2, it's understandable that if you are investing all this money in the US, you wanna, you wanna move to the US, you wanna bring your family here, you wanna you want to live here temporarily. So, for the E2, really, what is sufficient is a signed declaration by you, and if your spouse is coming with you, by your spouse as well, basically saying that, when your E2 visa expires, you plan to return to your home country. This being said, like, even this like doesn't prevent you from renewing the E2 visa. Like you can, it basically means that you will have to leave, but you can renew the E2 visa without, if you qualify without a problem. And another thing I just quickly wanted to mention here is that the E2 visa, like there is no limit as, like how many times you can, you can renew it. There are some visas like H-1B and Ls that have like limited period of time you can spend in the US on that status. E2 is not one of them. So like for E2, like you could theoretically like renew it indefinitely because there is no like set period of time. But because it's still a non-immigrant visa, I would say like if you have been in the US on an E2 for 20, 25 years, like at some point, like kind of like the intent may kind of come into question. But yeah, there is no kind of there is no limit as to how many times you can renew it. Perfect. So now let's go over, the investment amount and how much money you have to invest in the US. So the E2 investment must be substantial. For E2, there is no like minimum amount in the regulations. There is investor green card. It's called EB-5, where in the regulations, there is like a set amount you have to invest, and if you do, you kind of like meet that investment requirement. For E2, there is no amount in the regulations, and it will basically depend, the investment amount will depend on a couple things. So it will depend on, like on the type of business you are starting. So, like obviously the investment amount will be generally kind of like much lower if you are starting like a service-based oriented business, like for example, like a consulting company, in case you are starting a restaurant or, some sort of like manufacturing plan or like a factory, like in those cases, the investment amount will be much, much higher. Then another thing it will kind of depend on is kind of like the location, like where you apply and the examiner. So, the different consulates are kind of like used to seeing different investment amounts. So, there are some consulates where, like if you apply with anything under like $100,000, like they're not used to seeing such like low investment. And the application will be probably denied. There are other consulates where, like they're used to kind of seeing investment amount of like $70,000-$80,000, and like they kind of like seem that as substantial investment. So the location of kind of like where you apply does matter, because different consulates and kind of like different consular officers are used to kind of like seeing different things. Also, there are some consulates that, like they don't really like service oriented, like consulting businesses. They like more like, like restaurants, gas stations, and things like that. So like the location where you apply, it does matter. And then it depends on kind of like the overall strength of the application, so sometimes people can invest like lower, can do like lower investment if the business already, like let's say already has employees in the US, already started operations, is already taking revenue. So like let's say that you invested like $40,000 plus some working capital, so around like $60,000-$70,000. But the business already has 2 employees. The business has already been operating for a period of 2 months, is already taking revenue. In that case, like even though the investment amount is lower, you could still be approved, because you have already hired the employees, the business already operating, taking revenue. So I would say if the investment amount is on the lower side, you would want to make the other aspects of the application stronger to increase your chances for approval. So regarding the investment amount, what the government uses is so-called proportionality test. So, they usually look at kind of like how much money you invested, and what are kind of like the usual costs, to establish that type of business. Sometimes it's very helpful, like if you can find, like, let's say that you are starting like a consulting business or a particular type of business, and you can find like business articles discussing like this is the usual kind of like startup amount like necessary to get this type of business like up and running. If you can find articles like that, it may be helpful to include it in the E-2 application and show look, this article says like $40,000 is sufficient, like I invested over 60, and just kind of like make that argument. In case you are buying a business in the US, then the investment amount would be, then the consular officer looks at the purchase price, you paid, and then the fair market value of the business. As we already discussed, like franchises are a great option for an E-2. So now let's discuss briefly some good versus bad E-2 visa expenditures. So the good expenditures would be the ones I kind of went over in the beginning. So like, like any inventory you need, like any, like office equipment, computer equipment, like printers, scanners, like stuff like that, like office supplies, any money you pay for, like the business entity setup, any money you pay for website marketing, those would all be good E-2 visa expenditures. I would say that the bad or like the weak E-2 visa expenditures would be things like, like let's say that you are in your home country and then you fly to the US to like set up the entity and set up the bank account, and then you want to include like the cost of the flight and then cost of the Airbnb and then like the cost of the car. you rented while you were in the US, like doing all these setup activities. So those would be, we wouldn't generally include those because they are, the consular officers kind of view them as weak E2 visa expenditures. Another one would be, for example, or another one that, people often ask about is car, so can I purchase a car, and can we kind of include it as part of the E2 visa investment? So generally, we only recommend to include car where the car is kind of like absolutely necessary for, for that type of business to operate. So like, let's say that, like you have a restaurant, and then like the restaurant, like the significant portion of the restaurant's revenue is going to be like food delivery. So in that case, yes, it could be included. Let's say that, the business is doing kind of like home renovations or construction or something like that. And then you need to kind of like transport the equipment to the client sites. And, in that case, we may include the car and trailer. Also another type of business, like a food truck or something like that, of course, we could include it. So, in those types of cases, like, yes, we could include it and it would be, like an okay, like good E2 visa expenditure. Let's say that you are starting, like a consulting business like an IT consulting business, and you want to include the car because like you will need the car to come to, to your office and back to home every day. In that case, we wouldn't include it because, in those types of cases, the officers view it as a weak E2 visa expenditure. Perfect. And so do you have to hire employees? Yes, this is the so-called marginality requirement. So the E2 business does have to have either present or future capacity to generate enough income to be able to hire employees. So as I said, like generally, so two things. So like in case you purchase an already existing business in the US. In that case, the business would probably already have employees. So in that case, like when you apply for the E2, you would be submitting things like W-2s, like showing that the business had employees in the past, and payroll, like showing that the business currently have employees. In case you are starting a new business, it's not required that you have like employees at the time you apply, but in that case, you would want to submit a strong business plan with the application that shows hiring projections in the next 5 years. And you would want to show that in the next 5 years, by year 5, you will have at least 3 or 4 full-time employees. Now, people often ask, like, do the workers, do they have to be W employees, or can they be like 1099 contractors? So, generally the recommendation is that they are W2 employees, but there are, like certain types of businesses where, it's common in the industry, like a construction business, like home renovation business, and businesses like that, where, like it's custom in the industry that the workers are generally 1099 contractors. So, in some cases, it may be fine that they are contractors, but you would still want to show that you are paying them kind of, like high amounts. And even in that case, it may always be good to hire at least someone as a W-2, like an office assistant or like an office admin person as a as a W-2. So yeah, I think we went over everything. So I will turn it over to Dustin.
Perfect. Thank you, Michaela. Great information. And we are going to segue to a related topic. Michaela was talking about the need to employ US workers. And a very important part of that is the business plan. So I know a few questions have come in. Keep sending those questions in. Again, we do plan to get to all of those by the end of the presentation. So do you need a business plan? The general answer to this is because employment and convincing the consular officer or USCIS that your business will employ US workers, because that is such an important piece of an E-2 application. The general advice is you need a business plan if you don't already have those employees. So if you are purchasing an existing business and the business you are purchasing already has 3 full-time workers, there's a good chance you don't need a business plan, because then what you would include in your application is W-2 forms, your company's tax returns, and you would show we already have employees and we're going to continue that trend by employing them. So less important for there to be a business plan. However, if you are starting a new business and either you don't have 3 employees, you don't have any employees, or you don't have 3 employees, then a business plan is probably a good idea. And again, the reason for a business plan is to convince the government that you will actually have the number of employees that Michaela was talking about. So what does a business plan usually contain? Keeping a high level view, what the business plan is trying to do is to explain who you are, what your business is going to sell, how your business is going to sell a sufficient number of its products or services to then lead to the employment of US workers. Okay, so that's really in broad strokes what the business plan is showing, how your idea is going to lead to the employment of US workers. So the pieces of it would be an executive summary. So this is really a 1 to 2 page summary of exactly what I just said: who you are, what the business is going to sell, and how it's going to employ US workers. It is also the reason the executive summary is important, by the way, is that oftentimes consular officers and USCIS, they're not spending a lot of time with the application. So it's very unlikely that the government official who's reviewing your application is going through every page of the application. So the executive summary is critical because it assumes that an officer who looks at the business plan is only going to have time for a page or 2. So we want all of that key information in that executive summary at the beginning. In addition to the executive summary, a market analysis and research showing that you understand who your competitors are, you understand the size of the market, a marketing plan, so talking about how you're going to get clients and customers, maybe, for example, using social media, using a website, using in-person interactions, going to conferences, things like that. A personnel plan. This is really key because what the personnel plan is going to show is how many US workers the business will employ in each of the next 5 years after the business starts operations. So for each of those roles, you'll want to show what the job title is, what the job duties are for that job title, how much the person is expected to be paid, and when they'll be employed. And again, at the end of the day, what the business needs to accomplish is at least 3 full-time equivalent US workers within 5 years of starting operations. A comprehensive financial plan. So this is a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet and a cash flow statement for the next 5 years of operations. So that really is a key part of the business plan, because what that is going to tie directly into employment. The officer will want to see that the business is generating enough revenue from sales to justify, first of all, people being hired to perform services, and second of all, that the business is going to generate enough revenue to support not only those workers, but also the E-2 investor and their family. Do you need to hire a professional for the business plan? The answer is no, you don't need to hire a professional. If you want to prepare your business plan yourself, you certainly can. The one thing I will say, though, is that oftentimes it is very helpful to hire a professional. And the reason is that, especially if you hire a firm like ours, the audience that we have in mind when we draft a business plan is a consular officer. So it can be very difficult to kind of anticipate what questions a consular officer is going to want answered in a business plan and how to word a business plan so that it's understandable by a consular officer. Keep in mind that many business plans that are prepared by professionals generally have maybe investors in mind for the business plan or other business professionals. Consular officers are not business people. They are government workers. So it is important that the plan be framed so that it's understandable by a government officer and they can quickly and easily get the information they need to want to approve your application. So a professional is recommended, ideally a professional who understands the perspective of a consular officer. Let's turn to some recent E-2 visa developments and adjudication trends. I'm just going to pull those up. So these are some things we've seen over the last few years when preparing E-2 visas. The first is we have noticed that the government wants to see that at least half of the investment amount that Michaela talked about be spent in the US. So what does this mean? Just taking a step back, Michaela talked about how you do need to invest a substantial amount into the E-2 business and how that depends on what the business is you're starting. So let's say hypothetically you are starting a business that requires $100,000 to get it started. Let's say that it is a business that sells widgets. So can you spend, $80,000 of that amount buying widgets in China and then planning to sell them in the US? The answer is that you could, but there is a risk if you spend 80,000 of $100,000, 80% of the investment in China. We have noticed that certain consulates do look at that negatively and would want to see that you've spent at least 50,000 of your investment amount inside the US. Again, 50,000 is assuming 50% of the investment amount. So spend most of your investment amount inside the US. It is fine if you want to buy some of your products in Europe, in Asia, whatever it may be, but our recommendation is that funds spent abroad be a minority of your total investment amount. Try to purchase in the US if it's possible. Administrative processing. This, frankly, is probably the most annoying aspect of filing an E-2 application at a consulate, which is that sometimes a consulate will flag the application for additional security review. And when they do that, the consulate will oftentimes send the application to the United States, Washington, D.C., oftentimes, to the CIA, the FBI, the Department of State, whatever agency it is, for further review. The reason this is annoying is two things mainly. The first is it can take a long time. Sometimes it only takes a few weeks. Sometimes it takes a month, more than a month. Sometimes it can take a year or longer. And during that process, the application is out of the consulate's hands because, again, oftentimes it's sent to the US for review. So you can have a very successful E-2 interview, and then they can say, you know what, I really like this application. We're just going to forward this for some additional review, and it can be stuck in this black box for months. The other reason why this is annoying is that while some applications are flagged for administrative processing for clear reasons, such as if someone has traveled to a country that doesn't have the best relationship with the US, say Iran, there are other people who are randomly selected for this. We have actually had children selected for this, where their parents are not placed in administrative processing, but an 11-year-old's application is. And that is very annoying when that happens. Fortunately, this does not happen in the majority of applications. Administrative processing is still rare. So odds are your application will not be placed in administrative processing, but it is something we have seen happen more often than in the past. And when it does happen, it is annoying. Is there anything that can be done about it? The answer is that yes, there is. Once the application has been stalled, delayed for months, a year plus, then you can sue the government and they can be responsive to that. But until you've waited for a few months, suing the government is not really going to help. So keep your fingers crossed that your application is not placed in administrative processing. And if it is, hope that it's a fast process, which it sometimes can be. More USCIS filings. During COVID, of course, it became very difficult to travel. And a lot of people who were on E-2 visas and were inside the US found it difficult to go back to their home country to renew their visa. So we saw during COVID that many, many, many more people were choosing to extend their E-2 status through USCIS or to change from one status to E-2 status from within the US. Before COVID, it was far more common to apply at a consulate. And the reason for that is if you apply at a consulate, you get an E-2 visa. And a visa lets you enter the US and exit and enter again. Very convenient. A visa is also good for, as Michaela explained, up to 5 years, depending on your country of nationality. So having an E-2 visa is generally far preferable to having a USCIS approval. A USCIS approval is basically just an I-94. You basically just have an E-2 I-94. And if you've traveled to the US before, you know that an I-94 is only good during that stay. So as soon as you leave, your I-94 is irrelevant and you need to try to re-enter again. You can't re-enter based on an I-94. You need a visa. But COVID, we saw more USCIS filings. USCIS filings let's talk about some other negatives. Not only do you not get a visa with USCIS, it is also more expensive. So if you want, especially if you want to expedite the application, they offer a 15 business day option for, I believe it's about $2,500 that goes to USCIS. So it is expensive relatively to apply through USCIS. Also, USCIS will scrutinize the source of funds. You really need to show exactly where your money came from, that you're investing in the business. There are some pros to USCIS, though. USCIS tends to be less strict about the investment amount. So if you have a very low investment amount, USCIS might be a good option to go for. Especially if you're from a country with a consulate that expects a higher investment amount. Also, consulates, if they're very delayed, and again, we saw this during COVID, some consulates were delayed by a year, where you would submit your application and have to wait a year before your interview. USCIS's timeline actually is quick with a 2-week turnaround. Now, other consulates, especially now, and this relates to the last bullet you see, consulates are speeding up. So even though they were very delayed under COVID, they now are almost back to pre-COVID time. So what that means is, on average, you can expect, just looking across the board, 3 months is, I think, a helpful benchmark from the date you submit the application to the date of your interview. Some consulates are taking longer than that, and some are taking shorter, but I think that 3-month timeframe is a helpful one. During COVID, you would have to, and when I say during COVID, I'm talking 2020 through 2022, when we really were seeing long delays due to COVID at consulates. You were waiting 6 months to a year for an interview quite regularly. So fortunately, that is speeding up. I will quickly add one other benefit to a USCIS filing is if you are applying, if you're in the US and you say, you know what, I really want to start working for my E-2 company as soon as possible, but I also want to travel. Then what you can do is file an application with USCIS at the same time that you file with the consulate. And what that does is it gets you in line at the consulate. So if the consulate is taking, say, 3 months, excuse me, to call you in for an interview, you'll be in line for that. And when they're ready to interview you, you just fly to the consulate, have your interview, and come back in with your E-2 visa. And while you're in line for the consulate and waiting for that interview, you can have your USCIS application moving forward. And if you choose premium processing, you can have a decision within 15 business days of submitting that application. So once that application is approved by USCIS, you can start working for the E-2 company while you're waiting for the consular interview. So that can be a great option for those who are really looking to speed up the process. I'm mindful of the time. I want to make sure we get to the question. So I'm going to speed it up a little bit because Michaela did a great job of talking about really all of these issues and complex areas for E2s. Again, the source and trail of funds, USCIS is going to scrutinize that. So you want to basically have documents that track exactly what the source of the money is. Now, you can use loans, you can use gifts. Loans cannot be secured by the E2 business, but as long as they are a loan you've received personally or a gift you've received personally, that is generally a fine source of funds. The source of funds you need to be careful of are illegal sources of funds or those that have no documentations. Sometimes cryptocurrency can be a problem for that reason. But otherwise, broad options for source of funds. Make sure you document the source of funds, though. Small investment amounts. Michaela again talked about this extensively, and we have a separate presentation webinar on low investment amounts. Really what you want to do is strengthen the application in other ways. So first thing, can I spend more on the business? If the answer is no, then can I hire a US worker? If you can hire a US worker and go to your interview saying, even though I've invested less money, I've invested enough for the business to be operational and to employ a US worker. That is a very powerful thing and makes the investment amount less important if you already have a worker. E2 visas for two investors. This is possible because the minimum ownership is 50% to qualify. So you can have 50-50 owners. The other owner can be from any E2 treaty country if you want them to have an E2 visa. Or if it's just you, the other owners can be anyone. So you just need to own 50% of the business to qualify for the E2 investor visa. But for two investors, they both do need to invest in the business. They both do need to be actively involved in the business. So that is important. Substantive changes to the business. This does happen where you start an E2 visa thinking the business will do one thing, and either that becomes more difficult than you thought, or you find another opportunity. In general, you want to get approval for a substantive change before you do it. Otherwise, you could violate your work authorization. But this is an area where a conversation with an immigration lawyer can be very helpful because many changes aren't actually substantive. If they are substantive, again, get approval from USCIS and or the consulate before you do it so you don't get into trouble. The other tip is make your business plan broad for the initial application and include in the business plan anything that you think the business might do over the next 5 years so that there's not a substantive change because the business plan really does define the scope of the business. Family business purchases, it is okay to purchase a business from family, but you just really want to make it well documented and clear that you have paid the fair market value for the business. Because again, if you get a big discount on a business, the government is going to say, you haven't invested a substantial amount in this business. You haven't invested enough to make this business operational. You got a huge discount on it. So just make sure it's a bona fide purchase of a business and you document it. Maybe hire accountants to document everything, hire lawyers to make sure everything is properly executed. And common reasons for denials, it's everything we've talked about. Low investment amounts. Some businesses are risky, such as investment, real estate speculation. Some consulates are more strict than others. If there's concern over whether the business will create jobs for US workers, that is a make or break issue. So, if the consulate's convinced you will hire US workers, you're very likely to be approved. And if the consulate's convinced you won't, you're very likely to be denied. Issues with the adjudicating officers. Some officers are just not trained well. Some are in bad moods. And unfortunately, they do have discretion. The benefit is you can generally apply again. And oftentimes you'll be assigned a different officer. Finally, if you just didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing, some people come to our firm after they've applied and been denied, and we look at what was submitted and they don't own 50% of the business or they didn't invest in the business. So you do always need to satisfy those requirements. And to renew, really a lot comes down to employment. So hire US workers, 3 full-time equivalent workers within 5 years of starting operations. The salary, as long as it meets minimum wage, it generally is not important what they're paid. So in your renewal, you're going to include documentation, including the company's tax returns showing it has generated revenue and profits, showing W-2 forms and 1099s for any compensation paid to workers. And of course, that you still meet the requirements, that you still own 50% of the business, and that you're operating consistent with the initial business plan, or that you update them on any changes you plan for the future. So let's turn to our questions that have come in. If I own 50% of the new business and my wife owns 50%, can she get E-2S status? E-2S status is for a spouse that allows her to work with any restrictions. The answer is yes, she can apply for E-2S status. You really have the option there, and your wife. So if one of the spouses gets E-2 investor status, the spouse can apply for E-2S status, and that does provide unrestricted work authorization. So that would be the recommended path. If for some reason you both wanted E-2 investor visas, you could do that as well. So yeah, one of the reasons you might want to do that is if your spouse is from a different E-2 nationality and you wanted to employ E-2 employees from that country, the spouse would need to be in the US in E-2 investor status to employ employees from his or her country of nationality. What are the key elements to present to the US officer to show intent to return to Canada? So, first of all, this issue doesn't usually come up because of what Michaela said, where the E-2 is not dual intent, but explicitly you don't have to own a home abroad. You can sell your home abroad and apply for an E-2 visa. So things that we oftentimes would recommend to show ties abroad are, for example, bank statements from abroad. If you have records of ties abroad, such as family, children attending school, things like that. But again, this very rarely comes up and really is only worth worrying about if the consulate specifically raises it during the interview. Otherwise, oftentimes proactively, it's not even worth worrying about it. For UK nationals, you do need to prove that the UK is your country of domicile. So you do, if you're applying as a UK national, you need to prove that you actually have been living in the UK. Can you count yourself as an employee? No, you do not count as an E-2 employee if you are the owner, nor do your family members. So you need to hire US workers. A loan secured by company assets or a loan signed under the new US company name, would it be considered part of the investment amount? No. A loan cannot be secured by the E-2 company. A loan must be secured by something other than the E-2 company. So say a loan on your home would be fine, or a loan on another business that you own would be fine, but it cannot be a loan secured by the E-2 business. Can I use ESTA to come to the US and purchase a business? In general, yes, if you communicate to the border officer that you're coming to engage in authorized business activities on ESTA and not simply recreational activities, but coming to the US to look for a business to purchase is in general an okay business activity for ESTA or B1. Make sure you don't work for income though while you're here. You could get in trouble. If E-2 visa was denied, will my ESTA be denied as well? Yes, generally, if you're denied a visa, ESTA requires that you answer that question in the affirmative, and your ESTA would be canceled. That is important to keep in mind. And what type of questions are asked during the interview? Great question. Really, it's what Michaela talked about on this slide here. Let's go back. E2 visa requirements. So a lot of these are the common questions. So how much have you invested in the business? Where did you get the money from? How many employees will you have in 5 years? What will you sell? Things like that. What have you already bought for the business? Uh, things like that are very common questions for the interview. And what will serve, since it's 11, this will be the last question. Please let us know what will serve as proof at treaty country. I'm not sure I understand the question. What will serve as proof at treaty country, and what vintage of the business to be in treaty country to have strong chance? I do not understand the question. I'm sorry, but generally for an E2 business, any business that is illegal, so don't have a business in cannabis, but otherwise, any business that is legal in the US and will employ US workers is a fine business to run. So we've had tattoo parlors, we've had dog grooming businesses, we've had Montessori schools. You really don't need experience even doing those things as long as you are qualified and can make a good pitch for yourself as to why you're ready and able to develop and direct the business. Excellent questions. Thank you all for taking the time. Michaela, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Do keep an eye out, everyone, for our email. We hope to see you on future webinars. And in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can be helpful at all. Thank you and stay well.
Thank you.